Hi, I'm going to be talking about understanding package resolution in Node.js today. I'm Yagiz Nizipli. I am a senior software engineer at Sentry. I'm a Node.js technical steering committee member and an OpenJS Foundation cross-project council member. You can reach me from my GitHub account, github.com/anonreg, and from Twitter, x.com/Yagiz. So in summary, today we're going to talk about CommonJS, ES modules, ESM, package JSON structure, and package JSON loader in Node.js. So let's start with CommonJS. So CommonJS is the first and the most wide-known module resolution strategy in Node.js. It includes files with require, export implementations with module.exports or exports. It can have an extension of .cgs or GS. Require calls does not have to include the extension of the file, and loading a file is synchronous. So basically, if you want to do a conditional loading, let's say you have a function called read file, and whether just when this function is executed, you want to load a file and use that file, that implementation in your function, then you need to use require inside this function. The caveat of this implementation is that in the first line in read file, the lazy loaded module is question equal require.leader. That's going to block the execution of this file because it's a synchronous call, and it's going to block the I/O depending on the size of the file itself. As you can see, the extension is not required /reader. This means that first the loader is going to check for .gs extension, then .json, and so on and so forth. And then it will return a value, and then we can run this function. So in order to load this file without an extension, this implementation makes a synchronous call to the file system in order to understand if reader.js file exists. If not, it automatically checks for reader.json if exists, and so on and so forth. And then it will return an error if it's not found. This is particularly slow because in order to understand if that file exists, you need to make additional file system calls, and it will impact your performance. Small or big, it will impact it. So despite CommonJS implementation, as I said, CommonJS, in order to include additional modules with CommonJS, you need to call it with require. Inside that function that you want to require, you need to export implementation with module exports, and so on and so forth. So it can have an extension of .cgs, which is CommonJS, and JS implementation. But in ES modules, it's a lot different, the idea behind it. It's introduced in Node.js 8.5.0 with an experimental flag. In order to include files, you need to call it with import. If this import statement is on top of the implementation, like if it's not inside the function, then you can use import blah blah. But if it's inside a function, you need to await the import statement because import returns a promise. So export implementations with export and export default, and can have an extension of .mgs or gs and async loading a module file. So it's in the base, it's async loading structure. So in order to load the module conditionally, just like the previous implementation, you need to call it with lazy loaded module equal await import, and this makes this particular function an async call whether or not the lazy loaded module that do something is async or not. This is the main reason for this is that when you await an import a module, it doesn't block the I/O. On top of that, we talked about CommonJS file extensions and MGS file extensions. So how do we actually know what's going on? So we have this package JSON file in all of our projects. It contains metadata about our project, but Node.js only cares about 5 of those fields: name, main, imports, exports, and type. For the sake of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the type attribute. Type can be a module or a CommonJS. So I think you're understanding where I'm going with this. Example, we have a name, Node Congress 2024. We have a main attribute and we have a type, which corresponds to module. So how does Node.js know if we are using ESM or CommonJS? So first, it checks for file extensions. Node.js checks for file. If it's MGS, then it's ESM. If it's CGS or GS, then it is CommonJS. So finding the package.json. So we first check for the extensions. If the extension is basically a .js file, then we don't know what it is. Then we need to look for the package.json that we are executing the this file in. So we need to know the context. So Node.js tries to find the closest package.json in the directory tree until root. So it checks for app my project package.json and so on and so forth until the root. If it's not found, then it's going to assume something else. Node.js checks it, and whenever the package.json value is found, Node.js checks the type field in the package.json. And if it's module, it uses ESM loader, the loader implementation in Node.js. And if it's not, then it's CommonJS. So if type is not present, we couldn't find a package.json. What happens? If type is not present, we check for an experimental flag, experimental detect module. This is pretty new in Node 20 or 21. It automatically checks if the file that you're running is a CommonJS file or a ESM file. This is particularly new because this is an experimental flag and there are known issues with it, but we are working on it. So if we have experimental detect module, then we detect if the file is required, like if it's an ESM or a CommonJS. If not, then we fall back to CommonJS. So then we know how our application starts, because we know the initial script is written in ESM or CommonJS. But the issue is what happens if you want to require a file from ESM that's implemented in CommonJS, or you want to call a function that's CommonJS or an ESM from a CommonJS module. So what about Node.js module depth resolution? Like if you have a Node modules implement a package inside your dependency list and it's implemented in either CommonJS or ESM. So Node.js checks the type field in the package.json of the dependency. If it's module, it uses ESM, otherwise CommonJS. If type is not present, it uses the type of the parent package, which is the root package that our project's package.json contains it. So let's continue with some tips to improve the loading time. So because we talked about all of these package.json loader system calls, we talked about the detection, the extensions, and so on and so forth. So if you want to avoid all of those things, and if you want to start Node.js as soon as possible, what you could do is that you need to, if you have an ESM application, you can use an experimental default type CLI flag, which will automatically eliminate all of those checks, and it will always return ESM. It will not check for the extension. It will not check for anything else. It will just load the ESM loader. For existing projects, use a type field in package.json to specify the module type. If you don't have a CommonJS type, then we assume that it's CommonJS, but if you have it, then I recommend using it. For one-time scripts, let's say you want to execute node index.js and it doesn't have a package.json or anything else. So if you're running a one-time script, make sure that you have either in the same directory or in the parent directory, you have a package.json with a type field, so we know if it's an ESM or a CGS, and we don't have to traverse the whole file system in a file root path in order to understand if it's ESM or CGS. If you don't want to do that, if you don't want to have a package.json, you should use .mgs for ESM and .cgs for CommonJS. Of course, this hints us towards if it's an ESM or a CGS. If you on top of that, you can use experimental detect module if you just want to write .js, but you don't want to care about extensions or package.json, you can always use experimental detect module. But know that this is an experimental flag and it has some issues. On top of that, the first thing, you can use experimental default module for ESM if you want to go straight to the ESM path. So in order to improve the module resolution. As I said, by default, we check for .js, .json, and so on and so forth. Always use extensions in require and import calls. This is extremely important. In ESM, this is required. In CommonJS, it's not, but we recommend you to always use extensions. And thank you for listening, and I hope you learned something today.